In September of 2014, the people of Scotland went to the polls to determine their future by answering one simple question. Should Scotland be an independent country? Centuries of longing for independence and decades of successful political struggle have been reduced to 6 words on a piece of paper. Sounds like a simple question, right? Well, there's a lot of complexity behind that simple question that each Scot was being asked to answer. In the years ahead of the actual vote, the issue was hotly debated. The Scottish National Party had included the referendum as a major part of their election manifesto in the 2 previous general elections and worked hard to make good on the promise. When the legal wrangling was over and a date for the referendum was set, 2 official campaigns emerged. Yes, Scotland in favor of independence and Better Together in favor of remaining part of the United Kingdom. On the first anniversary of the launch of the Better Together campaign, the Sunday Herald newspaper claimed, privately, some inside Better Together even referred to the organization as Project Fear. The name came from the acknowledgement that the primary tactic of Better Together was scaremongering, fear-mongering. Fear is a favorite tactic of those in power who want to motivate people to take a specific action or, in the case of Scotland and Texas, prevent them from asserting their independence. Project Fear arguments in regard to Texas tend to fall into one of 3 broad categories. Texas is illegal. They won't let us. Texas is too hard. Gathered into a single statement, the total argument flows along these lines. Texas can't leave the Union because it's illegal and unconstitutional. The Civil War settled it. Therefore, if Texas tried, the federal government would never let us. Even if it wasn't illegal, we are far too integrated with the United States, making it impossible to leave. But even if we were to somehow magically pull it off, we're simply not big enough or strong enough outside of the United States to be successful. We'd be bankrupt in 10 years and begging the United States to let us back in. In some of our previous programs, we've covered many of these objections and showed them to be false. That doesn't stop the naysayers from continuing to try to scare people. Let's take a look at these 3 main arguments and see if they hold up. Texas is illegal and unconstitutional. A common accusation by those opposed to Texas is that the act of leaving the Union is illegal. Let's be clear. An accusation of the commission of an illegal act implies that those committing it are criminals, guilty of a criminal act. This is not a light accusation. However, when you ask your accuser to give you specific law that they think you're breaking, well, they don't seem to be able to come up with it. We've been fighting against this bit of misinformation for a long time. Here's a video we made over 4 years ago. If no law specifically prohibits a state from leaving the Union, then there must be some other law which, in their minds, applies in this instance. So when you press them on this, the accusation shifts to that of treason. Now you've really opened a can of worms. Here's the legal definition of treason according to the U.S. Constitution. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. This comes from Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. The reason this term is defined so clearly in the Constitution is that the framers, notably James Madison, knew that the accusation of treason is often the tool of tyrants. He explained the necessity to clearly define this in Federalist 43. As treason may be committed against the United States, the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it. But as new, tangled, and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent factions, the natural offspring of free governments, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other, the Convention has with great judgment opposed a barrier to this peculiar danger by inserting a constitutional definition of the crime. These guys were pretty smart, huh? Treason is a criminal act committed by an individual, not a political body, and so it can't be committed by a state. To continue to level the charge of treason, one would have to believe that everyone in Texas who would vote in support of Texit would be individually guilty of treason. This completely ignores the constitutional definition of treason. When confronted with the lack of basis for the charge of treason, the final charge is that of attempting to overthrow the government. In fairness, there is a federal statute in Title 18 of the U.S. Code that outlaws attempts to do that very thing. As you can see, the operative words in this statute, repeated 3 times, are force or violence, and given that a Texit, initiated by a legal process ratified by a vote of the people of Texas and secured by a declaration of the reclamation of the right of self-determination, is neither force nor violence, this accusation falls as well. Here's the short and sweet answer to the people who try to tell you that it's illegal for Texas to leave the Union.
Did you know that Texas has a legal right to leave the Union? It's as simple as this. Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution lists everything that states are forbidden from doing. Guess what's not in that list? Withdrawing from the Union. So therefore, under the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it is reserved to the states to decide. And Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution says that the people have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may think expedient. So Texas can absolutely 100% choose to leave the Union, but it's a choice for the people of Texas and the people of Texas alone.
That seems pretty clear to me. Now, what about those people who moan, the federal government won't let Texas leave? Well, there's little doubt that the federal government and its supporters would spend enormous sums of money lobbying against giving Texas even a vote on independence. When it reaches the ballot, they'll spend even more in actual campaign trying to persuade Texans that Texit will bring certain calamity. If they fail in that, what else can they do? When all arguments fail, the fallback is the threat of creating a sequel to the American Civil War. It's interesting to note that in recent years, when the federal government has had to comment on the issue of Texit, no elected official has ever made this threat. Instead, it's the federal apologists who throw out their apocalypse porn version of how events would unfold. Basically, their argument is, if Texas leaves, the federal government will empty out Fort Hood, arrest the Texas government, and shoot everyone who voted for independence. Don't laugh. Some form of that statement has been sincerely offered by many of those opposed to Texit. Most publicly, it was uttered in a debate by a member of the Texas State Republican Executive Committee speaking in opposition to placing a non-binding Texit question on the primary ballot. Often, those who make this argument are the same crowd that wants to reshape U.S. domestic policy to look more like Europe. However, in modern-day Europe, there's not a single example to show Europe wanting to use military power to override self-determination on the continent. There are no examples of the British threatening to use force to keep Scotland and the UK ahead of Scotland's 2014 independence referendum. And there's been no mobilization of troops on the European continent preparing to invade Britain in the wake of the Brexit vote. Those who are quickest to jump to the conclusion that Texas would invite a military invasion by the federal government are actually some of the harshest critics of U.S. military interventions around the world. You can't reasonably assume that the policy of the federal government from the mid-19th century would be the policy of the federal government 2 decades into the 21st. There's just no current federal policy regarding a state leaving the Union. There is, however, current federal policy regarding states and territories leaving currently established political and economic institutions. Those policies involve neutrality, or the use of military action in support of self-determination. If you look at it closely, it's pretty apparent the federal government wouldn't move to stop Texas once it's been decided by the people of Texas, and they most certainly wouldn't use military. It's just too impractical. First, there would be little or no public support for military action against Texans who would vote to leave the Union. There'd have to be a strong consensus from the remaining states to even consider something like that. In a recent poll by Survey USA of adults across 7 separate states, only 6% would back a military attack to keep a state in the Union. The use of military force would bring a swift condemnation from the international community and would damage international relations for years to come. It would also cause a huge shift in international policy related to the support of democratic institutions, essentially delegitimizing any efforts made by the United States, past, present, and future. You'd have to believe that troops would actually obey an order to fire on millions of Texas civilians and their leaders, whose only crime was invoking their right of self-government. With approximately 170,000 Texans serving in the United States Armed Forces, I don't think you'd have much luck in getting compliance. Although the lack of public support and the impracticality of military action are significant factors, the real reason the federal government won't stop Texas from leaving the Union is one of the biggest drivers of federal policy: economics. Economies hate disruption. Texas would definitely be disruptive, but it comes down to what is more disruptive. Ordering military intervention would be economically disruptive, and it would create shockwaves throughout the U.S. and global economies. Carrying out any type of military intervention would be even worse. The best course of action for the United States would be to prevent disruption in the most practical way it can, at the negotiating table. It's the most practical choice open to the federal government in dealing with a successful Texit vote. It's far easier to negotiate a free trade agreement with a Texas that's on its way out the door than it is to use the military to occupy its capital in Austin. It's easier to negotiate a currency union with Texas than it is to deal with the possibility of massive insubordination in your military. With a negotiated separation, the federal government has the opportunity to show that it believes in the principles it's been promoting around the world for the last 70 years. It's better to keep goods and services flowing than have them come to a dead stop. Forced integration into the Union at the point of a gun invites international condemnation and the loss of credibility on the international stage for the next 70 years. Now let's look at the really lazy argument. Texit is too hard. This goes hand in hand with the argument we can't make it on our own. We took that argument apart when we were together a few months ago, but let's take a look at some of those points again. If Texas were its own country, we'd be the 9th largest economy in the world. We saw a 10.1% increase in GDP at the end of last year, compared to the national average of only 6.9%. There are many reasons for this. In a recent 2021 survey by Chief Executive Magazine, American CEOs indicated the top 3 important considerations when evaluating an area to establish corporate headquarters. In order, they cited tax policy, regulatory climate, and talent availability. The economic environment in Texas makes a convincing case to move a company across the country. Texas' combined corporate tax rate is 21%, which is among the lowest, if not the lowest, in the U.S. Major metro homes are still cheaper than their equivalents in New York, LA, or D.C. We're in the center of the country. It's cheaper and less time-consuming to ship or fly. Corporate rent is half as expensive as Chicago, LA, or D.C. The state's resources make it a natural leader in petroleum and chemical manufacturing. Its research institutions have fostered computer-related and other high-tech manufacturing. And a business-friendly environment and skilled labor have helped create a burgeoning automotive manufacturing sector. Manufacturing directly employs about 909,000 Texans and contributed $241 billion to Texas' gross domestic product in 2019, about 13% of the state's total economic output. That's just a small sampling of why Texas is plenty able to take care of herself. I encourage you to go back and look at our September program to get the full story. While it is true that Texas is highly integrated with the United States, these political and economic ties are not so tight or intricately interwoven that it would be impossible to untangle them. In many instances, it wouldn't be necessary to untangle them at all. There's no part of the relationship between Texas and the rest of the United States that couldn't be accomplished by using existing state-level institutions and agencies, executing bilateral agreements between Texas and the United States, or by Texas signing on to multilateral international agreements that are already in place. All these issues, trade, currency, banking, and that old favorite question on Social Security and federal pensions, have all been thought about and accommodated. Texas is no weakling among countries in the world today. If people tell you we'll run out of money without our allowance from the federal government, here's a short video explaining why that's not a valid argument. Somehow, since 1945, 140 new, formerly dependent countries have been able to make it as independent, self-governing nation-states. The unspoken assertion is that to be able to do anything that Texas would have to do as an independent nation, it must be part of the United States. The implication is that Texas and Texans aren't as good or as smart or as capable as other nations. We know better than that. Texas not only does well in spite of the federal government, Texas is already structurally capable of doing everything that's traditionally done by a national government. In Texas, you'll also find a state-level analog for every single cabinet-level federal department. Texas even has its own military, the Texas Army National Guard, the Texas Air National Guard, and the Texas State Guard. Ultimately, Texans bristle at the suggestion that we simply aren't good enough to govern ourselves. We reject the idea that independence can't be done, as we remember the old adage that if you want something done, tell a Texan it can't be done. The real question is this: given all our natural advantage, if Texas can't make it as an independent nation, then who can? Project Fear is a last-ditch effort to try to make people think that Texas can't be done. We all know better. Texans don't respond to threats and fear by giving in. Instead, it's a surefire way to get Texans to do exactly the opposite. Project Fear is exactly that, fear. Fear can be healthy. It can challenge us to avoid dangers that are avoidable. It can also cause us to act towards self-preservation to protect our families. But Project Fear is the worst kind of fear. It's an irrational fear whose sole purpose is to try to make us act against our best interests. It's used as a tool of oppression to convince strong people that they are weak, to rob them of a heritage of freedom, and to denigrate them into accepting an inferior position in the world. The influence once held by the Texas version of Project Fear is waning as Texans begin turning the tables. No longer satisfied with smug answers from the opposition, Texas supporters are asking their own questions. The most important question is, if Texas were already an independent nation, given what I know about the federal government, would I vote to join the Union? I don't think so. The lack of real answers or legitimate alternatives from Project Fear is proving that they are, as Texans say, all hat and no cattle. Thanks for joining us this month. I hope we've shed some light on why the fear-mongering you hear from those against Texas independence is just that, fear-mongering. Our knowledge of the facts is what shines a light on the issues and shows us that our path is the right one. We'll see you next month.